My husband, Silas Thorne, was a brilliant prodigy, while I was just an ordinary girl. Silas had no patience for anyone he considered slow or dim-witted. I pushed myself to the limit to keep up with him, yet he remained perpetually cold, telling me I lacked the natural talent and was simply wasting my breath. Eventually, he moved on to bigger things and left me behind, so I found someone else. On my new wedding day, he stormed back into my life and held a blade to my groom's throat, asking if I really intended to marry such a loser. I stepped between them, taking my new husband's hand and looking Silas straight in the eye as I told him yes, because this man never once made me feel like I was a fool. Silas just laughed and asked if that was really the only reason. I gave him a firm nod and told him that was exactly the reason. On the day, Silas officially made it big and left for the city. The entire town of Oak Creek was packed with people celebrating his success. My front porch was practically overflowing with guests, which terrified my dog, Cooper, so much he just huddled by the door without making a sound. The neighbors kept talking about how lucky I was, reminding me how they all mocked me for being a fool when I first took Silas in. I was standing there completely speechless, staring at the luxury car Silas had sent to pick up his things. Silas looked down at me with a cold sort of arrogance, mentioning that his mentors told him he owed me a debt and that he would grant me one wish as payment. During the 5 years we spent together, I'd spent every single day hoping he would stay and build a life with me. While he focused on his career and training, I was the one working the fields and keeping us afloat. He focused on his personal growth while I focused on making ends meet, all because I hoped my devotion would eventually win him over. But Silas never cared for me. His heart belonged to his brilliant and beautiful colleague, Serafina Vance. Serafina was as intelligent as she was stunning, catching on to every complex lesson Silas taught her after hearing it just once. I tried to copy them in secret dozens of times, but the only thing I managed to get better was throwing birdseed a little further across the yard. When Silas and Serafina caught me practicing, she laughed so hard she actually started to cry. Silas, who always despised incompetence, just knit his brows and told me to stop wasting my energy because I simply didn't have the brains for it. Serafina tried to placate him by saying that since regular people live such short lives, being married to me for a few decades would feel like a mere heartbeat to someone like him. She argued it wouldn't interfere with their grand plans to stop the local crime syndicate, but Silas looked absolutely disgusted at the suggestion. It was obvious he was terrified I would ask him to stay with me forever. Standing there in his expensive clothes, he looked so distant and regal, nothing like the broken man I'd found 5 years ago who couldn't even eat without me feeding him. I realized then that Silas was never going to be my husband, so I decided to stop clinging to a ghost. I picked up my dog Cooper and told Silas that if he could just pay for the dog's surgery and get him healthy again, we would be even. Silas seemed taken aback for a moment, but he quickly realized what a bargain I was offering him. He made a quick phone call to the best vet in the state, and suddenly Cooper, who had been sick for days, was up and running toward his food bowl. Serafina looked relieved and grabbed his arm, ready to leave. Serafina urged him to go, saying that his ties to this place were finally severed and they needed to report back to headquarters. Silas gave me one last lingering look that I couldn't quite read before he drove away. As soon as he was gone, the excitement in the air seemed to evaporate instantly. The neighbors all started whispering about how foolish I was for wasting such a huge opportunity on a dog, and they began quietly taking back the gifts they had brought. I ignored them and reached out to catch Mrs. Higgins, the local matchmaker, before she could slip away. I asked her if she could do me a small favor. She asked me what I wanted, and I told her I needed her to find me a man. I specified that he should be handsome and reliable, the kind of person who wouldn't abandon his family the moment he had a little bit of success. Mrs. Higgins just shook her head in disbelief, looking like she didn't know whether to laugh at me or pity me. She told me she wouldn't dare help me because she was afraid Silas would come back and ruin her if he found out. I let out a long sigh and felt a tiny pang of regret for using my one wish on the dog. I really should have just made Silas find me a decent husband before he left town. A few days later, Mrs. Higgins was back at my door asking if I was still looking for a husband. She mentioned that this one wouldn't even cost me a finder's fee. I was skeptical immediately because usually if something is free, there's something wrong with it. She described him as a local guy who was incredibly handsome but completely useless at manual labor, basically a trophy husband in the making. I was about to tell her I wasn't interested, but the moment I opened the door and saw him, the words got stuck in my throat. I blurted out that I would take him right then and there. It is true that people always crave what they don't have, and I was no exception. He looked like a perfect gentleman out of an old novel, carrying an air of quiet sophistication that felt like a breath of fresh air in our dusty little town. While Mrs. Higgins was talking, he gave me a polite little nod and blushed the moment our eyes met. I couldn't stop staring at him because he was so refined. My family had been blue-collar for as long as anyone could remember, so we had never seen anyone this polished. Mrs. Higgins glanced at him nervously and wiped some sweat from her forehead before tucking her handkerchief away. She introduced him as Lucas Sterling, 25 years old, no family, no debts, and decently educated. I told him my name and mentioned that my previous guy had left for the big city and wasn't coming back. I scratched my head and suggested that since I knew how to work the land, he could handle the housework and his studies while we build a life together. He gave me a warm, gentle smile and nodded in agreement. That smile made me feel like I was walking on air, totally lightheaded. Mrs. Higgins let out a massive sigh of relief and said the deal was done. I tried to ask her about the matching fee, but she insisted she didn't want a penny. I was still trying to figure out why the usually greedy Mrs. Higgins was being so generous when she suddenly hurried away. I turned my attention back to Lucas Sterling and decided he was quite a catch. He was much more pleasant to be around than Silas had ever been. I nodded to myself, feeling very satisfied with the arrangement. Just then, his stomach let out a loud growl, which made him turn bright red once more. I couldn't bear to see such a handsome man go hungry, so I immediately rolled up my sleeves to get to work. I told him I would whip up some homemade soup and a couple of eggs. Even when he was eating, he managed to look graceful and polite. He finished every last drop, leaving the bowl so clean it barely looked used. He caught me watching him and shyly wiped his mouth, which was a huge change from Silas and Serafina. Silas was always on some strict diet and used to tell me that my home cooking smelled disgusting. Serafina was always obsessed with her weight and would only ever pick at a few pieces of lettuce. That night, I lay in bed feeling genuinely happy as I started planning out our future together. I was so excited that Lucas could read because it meant I wouldn't have to use little drawings to keep track of my expenses anymore. Then I worried that he might not want to help with the books, just like Silas, who was perfectly capable but never bothered to lift a finger for me. I remembered when Rick Jones cheated me out of half a basket of eggs 4 years ago. When I came home crying, Silas just gave me a cold look and told me it was my own fault for being so dim-witted. He asked me why I thought other people didn't fall for the same tricks. I had tried to explain to Silas that I wasn't born this way, but a high fever when I was 5 had left me a bit slow. It didn't matter if I was trying to sell something or just going about my business. Someone always found a way to take advantage of me. A few years back, I sold some poultry and ended up giving half the cash to a homeless man covered in sores because I felt so bad for him. Silas just laughed and called me an idiot, pointing out that the sores were obviously just fake makeup that would wash off in the first rainstorm. I just let out a sigh of relief as I watched the man walk away, saying I was glad he wasn't actually sick because that would have been so painful. Silas stared at me for a second before huffing and calling me a total moron. I was so used to being called names like that, but I decided to just let it go since he was out of my life and there was no point in holding a grudge. I was busy trying to figure out how to ask Lucas to help with the accounting when a sudden gust of wind blew my bedroom door open. I got out of bed to shut it, but a dark figure slipped inside as quietly as a cat. Before I could even turn around, I felt a warm presence right behind me and heard a soft, satisfied sigh in my ear. He whispered about how amazing I smelled and wondered aloud how it was possible for anyone to be that sweet. It was Lucas, looking absolutely mesmerizing in the moonlight with his shirt hanging open and exposing his chest. His hands looked slender and delicate, yet they gripped my waist with a strength that felt almost like a predator's hold. He wrapped his arms around me from behind and whispered in a low voice, asking if I felt lonely now that Silas had moved on to his fancy new life. I told him I wasn't lonely at all because I had Cooper and all the animals in the yard to keep me company. I looked at him with confusion and asked if he was feeling cold since he was barely wearing anything. He leaned against the door frame while I helped him straighten out his clothes. I was so focused on being helpful that I didn't notice the massive, beastly shadow he cast on the wall behind him. Lucas just tilted his head and gave me a tiny, knowing smile. His smile was so charming it made my head spin all over again. I felt bad that he had arrived with nothing, so I told him I would head to the market tomorrow to sell some eggs and buy him some fabric for new clothes. I decided we needed to get him a warm winter coat first, along with some nice red fabric for our wedding. Once he was properly dressed, he looked perfectly innocent again and told me he was hungry. I happened to have some dough ready in the kitchen, so I decided to make him a treat. I kneaded some sugar into it and fried the little cakes until they were perfectly golden brown on both sides. The autumn wood burned with a pleasant, smoky aroma that filled the room. Lucas sat there with his chin in his hand, watching my every move. I stopped for a moment to wipe the sweat from my forehead. I told him the kitchen was too messy and he should wait outside, but he insisted on staying with me. In the flickering candlelight, I saw his eyes light up with a strange intensity as the smell of the food filled the air. He remarked that the anticipation of a meal was often more satisfying than the meal itself. I warned him to be careful because the cakes were hot, and I nervously pointed out that the dark spots were just from the heat and not dirt. I was terrified he would react like Silas, who used to sneer at my cooking and my rough hands. But Lucas just took a big bite of the sweet filling and smiled, so widely his eyes nearly closed, asking how anyone could think something so delicious was dirty. It finally hit me that Lucas reminded me of those legends about foxes turning into handsome scholars. Once he finished eating, he curled up comfortably by the side of my bed. Part of me expected him to start grooming a tale that wasn't even there. He asked me to tell him my story, but I didn't think I had anything interesting to share. My name is Olivia Miller, and I have no memories of my life before I was 5. That was the year a terrible sickness swept through Oak Creek, taking both of my parents and leaving me all alone. The high fever I had at the time ended up doing some permanent damage to my mind. The local families took turns feeding me until I was old enough to start helping out. Folks around here are good people, and farm kids learn to be useful pretty early on. I spent my days gathering firewood and leftover grain, and I even managed to rescue a couple of sick chickens once. I remember standing in the pouring rain when I was 7, clutching those 2 sick birds and waiting for someone to claim them. Someone eventually told me that sick birds were just a liability and that I should just keep them. I managed to nurse them back to health, and pretty soon I had a whole flock of chickens. The neighbors used to say that even if I wasn't the brightest bulb, I certainly had a way with animals. While other people's hens were struggling, mine were constantly producing double yolk eggs. When I was 12, I found Cooper being bullied by some kids throwing stones and decided to take him in. I asked him if he was all alone too, and he just wagged his tail and whined at me. Having Cooper felt like I finally had a real family member. Then, when I was 14, I stumbled across Silas. He was unconscious and dressed in rags, clutching a rusted old sword like his life depended on it. Even in that state, he looked incredibly handsome and ethereal, like someone who didn't belong in our world. It was a scorching hot day, so I used some large leaves to keep the sun off him while I waited. I stayed there all day, hoping someone would come by and tell me he was abandoned and that I could take him home. Mayor Miller always told me that taking something that wasn't clearly discarded was stealing, so I had to be careful. Once the sun went down, I looked around to make sure the coast was clear and then quietly brought Silas back to my place. I sat there watching him, thinking it would be such a waste to just leave a man like that out in the elements. I started counting on my fingers, trying to work out a plan. My family used to have 3 people in it, my parents and me, and the mayor always said 3 made a home. Now I had Cooper and this new man, so I figured that counted as a family again. In my head, I decided he could be the father, I would be the mother, and Cooper could be our child. I was so happy to feel like I had a family again, even though Silas was in really bad shape. I spent days feeding him soup and porridge, and on the third day, he finally woke up. The first thing he did was grab his sword and point it at me, demanding to know where he was and who I was. I eventually found out he was a top-tier athlete from an elite academy who had suffered a massive career-ending injury. It explained why there had been so much news about a huge scandal and drama at his school lately. Silas stayed at my place to recover, planning to make a comeback in 5 years. I couldn't bring myself to make him do farm work with those talented hands of his, but Mrs. Thompson from the market used to tease me about it. She asked if I was ever going to put my handsome house guest to work, but I just told her he wasn't built for that kind of labor and it would only wear him out. She grumbled that a man shouldn't be getting a free ride and should at least help with the firewood. She huffed and said only someone as naive as me would treat a worthless stone like a precious gem. I told my first real lie then, claiming that he did chores when no one was looking and that he helped me with my reading and finances. In reality, Silas never touched a piece of firewood and never helped me with a single bill. He only stayed because he found that the quiet environment in Oak Creek actually helped his recovery more than he expected. I brought him some food and looked at him, hoping for a kind word. I asked him if he would consider staying with me for good if his plans didn't work out. He just gave me a freezing look and insisted he was going back to his old life, promising to pay me for my trouble when that happened. I told him he didn't owe me anything, but asked if he could just help me with my bookkeeping since I was always getting cheated. He just sneered and called me a fool, asking why I thought I was the only person getting scammed in town. I spent all night trying to figure out why I was such an easy target. I convinced myself that Silas didn't actually hate me. He just had a general dislike for anyone he thought was beneath him. In our third year together, Serafina Vance showed up, and that was when I realized Silas was actually capable of smiling. I watched as she affectionately wrapped her arm around his. I wasn't even upset about it, because I figured having 3 people in the house finally made us a real family, like the mayor talked about. Cooper would just have to go back to being a dog instead of being our kid. When I suggested that the 3 of us should just live together as a family in Oak Creek, Serafina's eyes went wide, and she burst into fits of laughter. She pointed at Silas, whose face had gone pale, and joked about how I wanted to be his wife. She completely misunderstood my point, though I wasn't really trying to propose marriage. I just wanted someone to stay with me forever, and I wouldn't have minded being a wife if that's what it took. Silas looked furious and told Serafina to ignore me because I clearly wasn't thinking straight. Serafina stopped laughing once she saw how mad he was. She sat on the porch railing and mentioned how their mentors had warned that his time in this town would be a difficult emotional challenge for him. She wondered aloud why other successful people got to deal with high-profile romances while he was stuck here. Silas seemed insulted by the comparison and barked out that I was absolutely not any kind of romantic interest for him. I didn't really understand what they were talking about, but it was clear that Serafina was someone special to him. She had everything he valued, beauty and brains. One day, she came to the market with me, and just by standing there, she helped me sell a whole day's worth of eggs in a single morning. No one even tried to haggle with her. They just gave her free snacks and little gifts until she was giggling with joy. Walking home with empty baskets, I felt a heavy weight in my chest. I realized Silas was right all along, because no one ever tried to take advantage of someone like Serafina. Serafina suggested that he should just enter into a sham marriage with me to satisfy some social requirement, so he could finally move on with his career. She sighed and said it was the only way he would ever get back to where he belonged. She told him that once he was successful again, he could just pay me off with whatever money or jewelry I wanted. Silas hated the idea, but eventually agreed, and 6 months later, I was excitedly buying red fabric for the ceremony. I made a nice suit for Silas and a veil for myself. We had a small ceremony and were officially married, which seemed to make Serafina very happy. She claimed that Silas had finally checked the right boxes to move forward in his life. Any spark of romance was gone as quickly as it had appeared, like a tiny ember burning out in a fireplace. I kept trying to catch Silas looking at me, but his eyes were always cold and distant. He didn't seem to have any interest in me at all, making even his wedding outfit look dull and lifeless. He reminded me of a flower that looks beautiful from a distance, but wilts the moment you try to get close. Even after we were married, he wouldn't let me touch him or even call him my husband. I just agreed out loud while secretly calling him that in my head. I figured that being married meant we should do things together. When Silas practiced his training, I tried to join in because I didn't want to be a burden. I tried to follow the same techniques he used with Serafina. I tried to throw the chicken feed with the same precision he used for his movements, but I ended up dropping the bowl instead. It made a loud clatter and spun around on the dirt floor. I hurried to pick it up, but ended up tripping and falling flat on my face. As I brushed the dirt off my clothes, I heard Serafina laughing again and saw the look of pure annoyance on Silas's face. Serafina eventually stopped laughing and said she actually felt sorry for me because she couldn't even bring herself to be jealous. Silas just gave me a quick glance and, for once, didn't call me a name. His silence felt even worse than his insults when he told me I was just wasting my time. Even so, I wasn't quite ready to give up on him yet. I spent time sewing a custom bag for his gear and even made a decorative charm for it, but he just threw them in the trash. I tried to get him to come to the market with me to help sell some poultry. I thought having him there would stop people from picking on me, but Silas wouldn't go. It was only when Serafina mentioned that she had spotted some local gang members at the market that he finally agreed to come along. He only came to keep an eye on things, and he made sure to keep a significant distance from me so no one would think we were together. Whenever someone asked if he knew the girl selling chickens, he would just look away and say he had never seen me before. Plenty of girls were checking him out and trying to get his attention as they walked by. He didn't really respond to them, but at least he didn't look at them with the same disgust he usually showed toward me. The moon was huge as we were walking home. I tried to make some small talk. I mentioned that I had made a decent amount of money, but had seen an old man on the street who looked like he was in a lot of pain. I told him I gave the man half my earnings because he seemed so miserable having to show off his injuries to get help. Silas just told me I was an idiot and that the man's injuries were obviously just fake paint. I asked him how he could be so sure, and since Silas was so much smarter than me, I figured he must be right. He didn't even bother to explain his reasoning to me. I just said I was glad he wasn't actually suffering because I knew how much it hurt to be sick. I wouldn't wish that kind of pain on anyone. I didn't mention that I felt a weird connection to that man. He was showing his wounds for money, just like I was constantly trying to show Silas my devotion just to get him to stay. It felt like we were doing the same thing. Silas seemed taken aback for a second before he just called me an idiot again and kept walking. I had heard him call me names 1,000 times, but for some reason, that one really stung. I stopped talking and started trailing behind him. Silas didn't even notice I was falling behind, or maybe he just didn't care. By the time I made it back to the edge of town, I was crying, and it was already late at night. The streets were empty except for Cooper, who came running to meet me with his tail wagging. That was the moment I finally realized what I needed to do. I decided I was done with Silas, no matter how much I had wanted him. Lucas suddenly put his finger to my lips to quiet me. He told me that Silas hadn't actually succeeded and that his dishonesty had caught up with him. I was getting so sleepy, I just rubbed my eyes and didn't bother to ask what he meant by all that. I asked Lucas how he had spent his own life, but he didn't give me a straight answer and just gently patted my back instead. As I started to drift off, I found myself clutching the edge of his shirt. Instead of talking about his past, he started telling me a story about a cat that had lived for a long time and had grown 9 tails. The cat wanted to become a deity, but its teachers said it had to make up for past mistakes by using its tails to grant wishes for humans until it found someone who truly cared for it. People asked for long lives and riches until the cat was down to its very last tail. I took a moment to really think about the story. I asked why nobody ever used their wish to help the cat become a deity. Lucas looked surprised and gave me an even bigger, more beautiful smile. He told me that eventually the cat met a child who didn't want anything for herself and only wished for the cat to finally achieve its dream. I must have been half asleep because for a second I thought I saw strange, cat-like markings appearing on Lucas's handsome face. He rested his chin on one hand and used a sharp-looking fingernail to gently poke my chest, saying he was just like that cat, trading wishes for a sincere heart. He looked at me and told me he was starving. Having Lucas around was like having a personal magician. Every single morning I would wake up to find the firewood chopped the animals fed, and the entire house spotless. He even gave Cooper a bath until his fur was shiny and clean. He knew the people in Oak Creek had been kind to me over the years, so he would always step in to help them out whenever they had extra chores. Mrs. Higgins would always laugh and tell me what a lucky girl I was to have found such a hard-working man. Lucas even took the time to set up a proper bookkeeping system for me. He tried to teach me how to use it, but even after 2 lessons, I was still confused. He asked me if I got it, and even though I didn't, I lied because I didn't want to feel like an idiot again. I told him I understood, but he saw right through me and just patted my head. He told me he would handle the books when we went to the market and said it was perfectly fine if I needed more time to learn. During the day, that mysterious, playful side of him disappeared. He stopped acting like a trickster and started looking more like a respectable schoolteacher. I told him he shouldn't work so hard and that I could handle the messy jobs like feeding the chickens. He just smiled and said it was no trouble at all, looking at me with those clever eyes. He asked if I had any other wishes or if I wanted him to come to the market and take care of anyone who tried to push me around. I just shook my head no. Part of me really wanted his company at the market, but I was worried it would be beneath him. I knew he was too kind to say no, so I didn't want to put him in that position. I decided not to ask, but then he suggested we go buy some fabric to make me some new clothes anyway. He was so good-looking that every woman we passed on the way couldn't help but stare at him. One particularly bold girl completely ignored me and started flirting with him, asking who he belonged to. Lucas just grabbed my hand and gave her a charming smile, telling her that he was already taken by me. Hearing him say that made me feel so proud that I actually started walking with my head held high. It turned out Lucas had plenty of money, and he pulled me into the fanciest clothing store in town. The store was full of expensive fabrics I couldn't even dream of owning, so I whispered to him that we should leave. He just gave me a wink and told me not to worry because he had it covered. He spent a small fortune on 2 beautiful red outfits for our wedding. It was my first time ever wearing silk, and it felt incredibly smooth against my skin. Lucas insisted on buying me all sorts of makeup and jewelry too. When I finally looked at myself in the mirror, I realized for the first time that I was actually a grown woman of 19. We spent the whole day shopping, and he even picked up some high-quality wine on the way out. He said we should have the very best for our wedding celebration. That was actually the first time I had ever tried wine in my life. I noticed that while Lucas had a huge appetite, he couldn't handle his alcohol nearly as well as I could. He asked me if I was happy and if there was anything else I wanted. I just shook my head and told him everything was already perfect. Lucas was clearly tipsy when he started boasting about how he could give me anything in the world, even titles and riches. He claimed he had the power to make anyone a king if he felt like it. I didn't really understand what he was talking about, but I told him how impressed I was anyway. He was definitely starting to feel the effects of the wine. He leaned in close and looked at me under the moonlight, asking if I would give him my heart. I just gave him a simple nod and said yes. He seemed annoyed that I agreed so quickly and asked if I even understood what he was asking. I told him that I did. I might not be the smartest, but I knew he wasn't entirely human. I suspected he was some kind of creature that needed a human heart, but I didn't care because no one had ever treated me with so much kindness. He gave my cheek a playful little nip and sighed, saying I was so easy to fool almost made him feel guilty. We started making final preparations for our big day. Unlike my secret wedding with Silas, Lucas wanted everyone to know. He wrote out beautiful invitations for the whole town and even made handmade decorations for the house, including a little one for Cooper's kennel. He was so organized that he even rented a cart to pick up the drinks himself to make sure everything was perfect. The autumn weather was beautiful, and we took our time enjoying the slow ride back. Lucas picked a little flower and tucked it behind my ear while the bottles clinked together like music in the back of the cart. He just relaxed and watched the birds flying south for the winter. He told me he was starting to think that living a simple life was actually pretty great. When the wedding day finally arrived, the whole town showed up and Cooper was barking with excitement. Mayor Miller got a little choked up thinking about my parents, but Mrs. Thompson told him to focus on the happy occasion while she grinned at how handsome Lucas looked. Everyone kept talking about how lucky I was to find such a good-looking husband. Lucas gave my hand a secret little squeeze, But then someone suddenly smashed our wedding table before we could even finish our vows. I recognized that weapon immediately. It belonged to Silas. I turned around to see him standing there looking absolutely furious, and all our guests started running for their lives. Silas seemed stunned for a second when he saw me in my wedding dress, but he quickly regained his composure and mocked me for wanting to marry a monster. It felt like Silas went out of his way to hurt me. With one move, he had destroyed everything Lucas and I had worked so hard to prepare. All the wine we had carefully brought from town was now all over the floor. Silas pointed his blade at Lucas and told me that everything Lucas had done for me was just a trick. Silas pulled out some high-tech device he had brought from the city, and as soon as he turned it on, Lucas started to lose his human appearance. Lucas was left sitting in the middle of the ruin party, looking half human and half animal. He looked exactly like the creatures from the scary stories people tell, complete with sharp claws. Silas explained that Lucas was actually a dangerous criminal who had been hiding out to recover from an old injury and needed a human heart to get his strength back. I wiped my eyes and just asked him what his point was. Silas seemed shocked that I didn't have a bigger reaction. I finally started crying, and surprisingly, the same man who had always looked down on me actually tried to reach out and comfort me. Silas tried to speak more gently, telling me that I was being a fool and that Lucas was only being nice to me so he could hurt me later. I just wiped my face and stepped right in front of Silas's weapon. I told him that Lucas was my husband, and if he wanted to get to him, he would have to go through me first. Silas told me I was being stubborn and was just blinded by the guy's good looks. He said he finally realized what I wanted and offered to stay and be my husband if I just let him finish the job. I told him flat out that I didn't want anything to do with him. I ignored Silas and used my handkerchief to clean the blood off Lucas's face. Lucas reached up with one of his hands and gently wiped away my tears. He told me not to cry and joked that the attack hadn't even hurt. He tried to shift back into his human form a few times, but couldn't quite manage it, so he just gave me an embarrassed little smile. Silas pointed out that Lucas was powerless now and asked why I would still want to be with someone so useless. He was right about one thing. Lucas didn't have any special tricks left. There is no magical way to fix the mess Silas had made, so I just started picking up the broken dishes by hand. Lucas got up and started helping me without saying a word. He told me that even without his powers, he could still handle a bit of cleaning. Cooper stayed right by his side, growling at Silas the whole time. Silas asked me if I was really that obsessed with the expensive things Lucas had provided, claiming they were all just part of his act. He kept insisting that Lucas was nothing more than a failure now. It was almost funny how Silas had never actually known me. He really thought I was just some shallow girl who was only interested in his looks or status. He probably thought I was only with Lucas for the same superficial reasons. I just looked at him and reminded him that since he already thought I was a fool, he shouldn't be surprised that I was just a regular person who cared about the man who was good to me. I told him that as far as I was concerned, a husband and wife were supposed to protect each other, and if he wanted to hurt Lucas, he would have to take me out too. Silas wasn't allowed to harm regular people, so as long as I stayed his way, he couldn't do anything. Lucas had to live like a regular person after that. We would get up at the crack of dawn to clean the chicken coops, and then make the long trek to the market just to earn enough to get by. Our lives became a simple routine of daily chores, but Silas was always there in the background, watching our every move. Even without his magic, Lucas was still great with the books and would spend his free time patiently teaching me how to do it. One day at the market, someone mentioned my marriage. I looked up and saw Rick Jones, the same guy who had cheated me before. I immediately grabbed my purse and stepped in front of Lucas to protect him. He asked if I was selling eggs, but I told him I wouldn't sell a single one to him. He started mocking me, calling me a fool and saying that my inability to keep track of things was the only reason I thought he had scammed me. I tried to ignore him, but Lucas stepped up and told him that my kindness wasn't an invitation for his nonsense. He suggested that if the guy had trouble with math, maybe he would understand a more physical lesson instead. It turned out that Rick was a much better fighter than Lucas, and we ended up losing another basket of eggs. By the time we started heading home, the sun had already gone down. The sky was full of stars, and the fields were silent as we walked. Lucas was grumbling under his breath about all the things he would do to Rick once he got his powers back. He was limping along and kept apologizing to me, feeling terrible because he had tried to stand up for me, but ended up losing the fight. For some reason, I wasn't even worried about the lost eggs. I just felt bad that Lucas had gotten hurt. I realized that as long as I had him by my side, those little things didn't matter. Losing some property and being mocked didn't feel so bad anymore. He told me he was 100 years old and had never actually lost a fight until that day. I knew he was exaggerating since he had obviously lost to Silas before, but I didn't call him out on it. He mentioned that even with the bruises, he was starting to really enjoy being human. He pointed out that even though Rick won the fight, the guy had no one at home to care for him, which made him the real loser. Cooper was already waiting for us at the edge of town. The dog came running up and started playfully nipping at Lucas's heels, making him yelp in pain. Seeing him in such a state made us both burst into uncontrollable laughter. We both kept asking each other what was so funny, but neither of us had an answer. Cooper didn't have a clue what was going on, but he was happy just to be included. In that moment, all the stories about monsters and powerful city elites felt like distant legends. We were just two regular people making our way through the world together. Under the light of the moon, Lucas reached out and tentatively took my hand. That simple, honest gesture made my heart race faster than any of his smooth lines ever had. I suddenly found myself thinking about that first night we spent together, and it made me so nervous I accidentally jerked my hand away. I stammered that something must be wrong with me because my heart was pounding so hard. We caught each other's eyes for a second before we both looked away, feeling shy. We realized then that both our faces were bright red. Lucas looked at me nervously and pointed to his chest, saying he thought he might be injured too. He told me that even without any sweets, he felt a strange, sugary sensation in his chest. Cooper just tilted his head and barked 3 times, probably wondering what was wrong with us. Usually Cooper only barked like that when he wanted more food. We realized then that Silas was standing right by our gate, looking like he had been there for a long time. He was holding our basket of eggs and looked extremely uncomfortable as he told me he had gotten them back for us. I was shocked that he would actually help me out after everything he had said about staying out of my life. I thanked him but told him we didn't really need them anymore. He seemed surprised since he knew how much those eggs had mattered to me in the past. I looked at his expensive gear and his perfectly clean suit. I realized that all he had to do was show up, and Rick Jones would have been terrified enough to give the eggs back immediately. Something that was a huge struggle for me was absolutely effortless for him. The memory made me feel a sudden wave of sadness. I told Silas that no matter what he did, I wasn't going to let him take Lucas away. He just kept insisting that Lucas was a liar. He paused for a moment and then told me that he wasn't interested in Lucas and that his focus was entirely on me and the connection we shared. He claimed he had finally learned what it meant to care for someone and wanted to spend his life proving it to me. He insisted he could do all the chores and help me at the market even better than Lucas could. He seemed completely different from the arrogant man I used to know, and he was even blushing as he spoke. It seemed he had finally developed some feelings, but I wasn't sure if that changed anything. I didn't hold a grudge against him for how he had treated me in the past. I had spent years caring for him, but I knew you couldn't force someone to love you back just because you were good to them. He didn't owe me his love, and it was his right to reject me. What he shouldn't have done was treat my feelings like they were worthless. I told him that I had always wished I could be as smart and beautiful as Serafina. I finally had an answer to the question he had asked me years ago about why I was always the one getting scammed. I explained that there will always be people who are sharper than others, and I was fine with being the simple one as long as it was for Lucas. If he was kind to me, I didn't mind being fooled. When two people are happy together, all the logic and fairness in the world don't really matter. Silas just stood there in silence, looking completely lost and full of regret. He finally managed to apologize for all the mean things he had said to me. I told him it was okay because his help with Cooper had already settled any debt between us. I decided not to waste my energy hating him. Keeping a grudge felt like having to get out of bed a dozen times on a freezing night just to check a lock. It was just too exhausting. Lucas nervously grabbed my sleeve and promised me he would never lie to me again. Before we knew it, winter had passed, and the town was beautiful with spring flowers. A new school opened up, and Lucas actually became a teacher there. Silas decided to stay in Oak Creek too, opening a small clinic where he provided free medical care to the locals. Serafina tried to get him to go back home several times, but he refused. He told her he needed to stay here to work on himself and learn how to be a better person. We finally had our proper wedding in the spring. Some of the guests were still a little nervous about Silas being there, but he hadn't touched his sword in months and was just helping people. He looked like a perfectly normal country doctor in his simple clothes. If it hadn't been for the drama at our last wedding attempt, most people probably would have forgotten he was ever anything else. We had a great turnout, and even Rick Jones showed up with a couple of chickens as a gift. I told him he was welcome to join the party and offered him a seat. I figured there was no point in holding on to old grudges. Even that old man I had helped before showed up and left a small donation for us. He seemed familiar, but I couldn't quite place him. Silas, however, looked absolutely floored when he saw the man. The old man just waved him off before Silas could say a word. Silas started to say something, but the man just turned and walked away into the night. Eventually, all our guests left, and the house was finally quiet. Cooper had worn himself out wagging his tail all day and was fast asleep in his bed. It was just me, and Lucas left in the warm glow of the candlelight. Lucas looked absolutely stunning in his wedding red, losing that serious teacher look and becoming that captivating man I first fell for. I couldn't take my eyes off him. I asked him if he had ever done anything truly terrible in his past, because I was worried about him being punished. He immediately became defensive. He swore that he had never harmed anyone, explaining that while some of his kind were violent, he preferred to trade favors for the affection he needed. He told me that just when he was old enough to start making his way in the world, he had been attacked by Silas's mentor. Apparently, the old man had called him an animal and said he would never amount to anything because he didn't understand what it meant to be human. Lucas had been offended and asked for clarification, and the old man told him he would only truly understand life when he found a heart he cared for too much to hurt. He held me close and admitted he was glad he had stayed on the right path. Otherwise, he never would have gotten to enjoy my home cooking. I worried about what would happen to him in the future, since he was going to live for so long and he enjoyed eating so much. I asked him what he would do once I was gone, and he just gave me a quick kiss and said he already had everything figured out. He told me he would wait until I was an old woman and then take my heart, so he could finally become the powerful leader he was meant to be. He talked about how he would be unstoppable and able to go anywhere he wanted. I looked at him and asked what he would actually do with all that power. I knew he would look incredible in that role, even if I wouldn't be there to see it for myself. He said he would spend his time waiting for me to return, and when people asked who he was waiting for, he would have an answer ready. He held his head high and said he would tell them he was Olivia Miller's husband and that he was just waiting for me to come back to him. I used to absolutely loathe Olivia Miller, partly because I thought she was slow, but mostly because my mentors said she was the key to my personal growth. They told me I was too detached and didn't care enough about other people. When she rescued me 5 years ago, I realized immediately that the emotions everyone talked about were completely unpredictable and made no sense at all. I saw how kind and genuine she was, but I kept telling myself that it was just a sign of her being simple-minded. I was Silas Thorne, a top-tier talent who was admired by everyone, and I refused to be held back by something as trivial as feelings. I believed I deserved someone as brilliant and successful as Serafina. Olivia just seemed so clueless, failing to notice when people were using her or even how much I disliked her. She spent all her time trying to make me look good and lying to herself about our relationship. When Mrs. Thompson mocked me for being a deadbeat, Olivia made up stories to protect my reputation. I didn't understand why she bothered, because I didn't care what those people thought of me. She would ask to tell me about her life, and I would just tell her I wasn't interested. I felt like I already knew everything there was to know. She wanted to talk about her childhood, her pets, and her dreams of having family. I didn't want to hear any of it, because I didn't want any kind of connection with her. I destroyed the gift she made for me and told her that her cooking was repulsive. Despite how cruel I was, she still agreed to the sham marriage just to help my career. I saw her looking at beautiful wedding dresses, even though she could only afford a roll of plain fabric. She used all the good fabric to make me a suit and only kept enough for a small veil for herself. Even when the shop owner tried to sell her a real dress, she turned it down. She looked away and lied to me, saying she didn't even like the fancy dresses. Her constant lying was just another reason for me to dislike her. I actually felt a tiny bit of sympathy for her when she realized she had been cheated by that beggar. But she was so simple that she managed to cheer herself up almost immediately. She said she was just glad the man wasn't actually there. Part of me felt like if I just said one kind word to her, things might have been different between us. Instead, I just called her name. I could tell she was crying as I walked away. I knew she would have forgiven everything if I had taken a little bit of time. A regular guy would have comforted her, but I wasn't that kind of man. I was determined to suppress my emotions, no matter how strong they were. I refused to let any feelings for her take root. My teacher saw right through me and asked if I was afraid. I denied it, but deep down I knew he was right. The idea of losing control to my emotions was terrifying. He told me that without compassion, I would never truly be successful. I figured I just needed to settle my debt with Olivia for the 5 years she had taken care of me, and then I would be free. When I told her I would give her anything she wanted, I was actually curious to see if she would ask me. I expected her to ask me to stay with her forever. I was prepared to agree to it, but she surprised me by turning me down. She thought about it, and then looked at me with no emotion left in her eyes, telling me to just take care of the dog, and we would be even. I just stared at her, feeling a strange pain in my chest that I couldn't explain. I also knew that Lucas wasn't the saint she thought he was. Everything he did for her was just a trick to get what he wanted. I believed he was only being kind to her, so he could eventually take her heart. Olivia was too naive to see through his act, so I used that device to strip him of his powers. I figured that without his tricks, she would finally see him for who he really was. Instead of leaving him, they seemed to get even closer as he helped her with her work and chores. Without his powers, he couldn't even protect her, and ended up getting beaten up and looking like a total failure. All I had to do was say a single word and I got her eggs back. I was sure that she would be embarrassed by Lucas's failure and would choose me instead. I thought she would finally realize I was the better choice, but she just came home helping Lucas walk, both of them looking battered but happy. I couldn't understand how they could be laughing and smiling after everything that happened. It turned out that Olivia's needs were incredibly simple, and I had been too blind to see that. She forgave me without a second thought, but I knew I would never be able to forgive myself. I stayed in town to help the people who had been good to her, and seeing their genuine gratitude made me realize just how arrogant and superficial I am. I finally understood why she was the key to my growth, because the kindness and sincerity she had naturally were things I would have to spend the rest of my life trying to learn. This story is not about power or talent. It is about the simple truth that love cannot be earned through suffering, and kindness is not a weakness. Olivia spent years believing that if she just gave enough, endured enough, and stayed patient enough, Silas would finally see her. But Silas never wanted to see her. He valued brilliance and beauty, not the quiet devotion of a woman who fed him, protected him, and asked for nothing in return. When he left, Olivia did not fall apart. She found Lucas, not a prodigy or a hero, but someone who treated her with warmth, who helped her with the books, who lost a fight trying to defend her, and who made her laugh even when everything was broken. The lesson here is painful but clear. You cannot force someone to love you by shrinking yourself. And the best relationships are not built on admiration or debt. They're built on two people choosing each other day after day without pretense. Silas had everything, but he understood nothing. Lucas had nothing but his word, and he gave her everything. In the end, the greatest magic is not power or talent. It is showing up, being honest, and loving someone not for what they can do, but simply because of who they are. That is the only wish worth making.